The silent suffering. In the grand halls of a cold, dark mansion, a young alien girl lay silently in her room. The walls were high and forbidding, built with strange materials that shimmered in the dim light. But despite the beauty of the mansion, it was a place of pain for her. She was paralyzed. Her legs would never move again. Her name was Lyra. Once she had been a child filled with dreams, laughter, and hope. But now, those dreams had turned to dust, and hope seemed as far away as the distant stars. Every day, she lay in the same spot, staring out of her window, watching the world go by. People on her home planet of Theron, an advanced alien world, didn't know what to do with her. She was the daughter of a powerful baron, yet no one saw her as important. She was a burden, a mistake, a reminder of something her father had tried to forget. Her father, Baron Tarek, was a respected leader on their planet. He had a reputation for his strength, his power, and his ruthless ways. He ruled with an iron fist, ensuring no one crossed him. But when Lyra was born, something went wrong. During her birth, complications arose that left her paralyzed. From that moment on, her father saw her as a weakness, something that tarnished his perfect image. He didn't want a daughter who couldn't walk, couldn't run, couldn't fight like the others. The love that most fathers feel for their children was something Lyra would never experience from him. Tarek never showed affection. He never visited her room, never spoke to her with kindness. Instead, he left her alone with only the cold silence as her company. The mansion was quiet, except for the sound of her own breath and the distant echoes of her father's harsh orders. Every so often, servants would bring her food, but even they seemed distant, as though they were afraid of catching her weakness. She could see the pity in their eyes when they looked at her. Lyra hated it. She didn't want pity. She wanted something more, a chance to prove that she was just as capable as anyone else. But in this world, that seemed impossible. As she lay in her bed, looking out the window, her thoughts often drifted to the past. She remembered the days before her injury, when she had been full of life. She had been fast, strong, and eager to explore. Her father had once smiled at her, praised her for her skills. But after the accident, everything changed. Her father's attention shifted, and his cold demeanor made it clear that she was no longer of value to him. Lyra had tried, many times, to move her legs. She would close her eyes and focus with all her might, willing her body to respond. But it never did. The doctors had told her that there was no cure, no chance of recovery. Her spine had been damaged beyond repair. On her darkest days, when the pain of her situation seemed unbearable, Lyra would stare at her reflection in the window. She saw a young girl, broken and alone, trapped in a body that didn't obey her commands. Her once beautiful alien features were marred by the sadness in her eyes. Her skin was a soft shade of blue, with markings that ran like veins through her face, signifying her lineage. But no one cared about her markings. No one cared about her. She had lost hope, a feeling she didn't even recognize anymore. All she could do was stare out the window, watching the people below go about their lives, oblivious to the prisoner in the mansion above them. She envied them. They could walk. They could run. They could live. But her life, it felt as if it had already ended before it had truly begun. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, something strange happened. Lyra felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, like a whisper that brushed her skin, but it was enough to stir her curiosity. She glanced out the window again, but this time her eyes were drawn to something different. A figure stood at the gates of the mansion, an unfamiliar face, a human. Humans were rare on Theron, and their presence always stirred curiosity. Lyra had heard stories of humans before, but they were often seen as outsiders, not to be trusted. But this human seemed different. He wasn't like the others she had seen in passing, who merely passed through her life without a second glance. There was something in his posture, something in the way he looked up at the mansion, that caught her attention. The human stood still, his gaze fixed on the building, and for a moment, Lyra felt a strange connection. It was as if he had seen her, even though he couldn't possibly know she was watching from above. She wondered, for the first time in years, if there was someone out there who didn't see her as weak. Someone who might look past her disability and see her for who she truly was. Someone with potential. Someone with strength. But the moment passed quickly, and the human walked away, disappearing from view. Lyra was left staring out the window, her heart racing in her chest. Was it just her imagination, or had something changed? In that moment, she realized that she couldn't continue to wait for someone to come and rescue her. She would have to find her own way. But how could she, trapped in this body, abandoned by her father, with no one to support her? Little did she know, the arrival of that human would set in motion a series of events that would change her life forever. The silence of her suffering would soon be shattered, and the world she had known would never be the same again. A glimpse of hope. As Lyra stared out the window, something caught her attention. At first, it was just a faint movement in the distance. She rubbed her eyes, uncertain if she was seeing things. There, standing at the edge of the mansion's grounds, was a figure. A human. The air felt different suddenly, charged with a kind of energy she hadn't felt before. Lyra leaned forward, her heart racing. She could see him more clearly now. A tall man with short, dark hair, wearing simple clothes that seemed out of place on Theron. His presence was unusual, not just because he was human, but because his demeanor was something Lyra had never seen before in the eyes of anyone else who visited the mansion. Most visitors, particularly those from powerful families like her father's, would avoid eye contact with her. They would treat her as if she were invisible, a reminder of her father's failure. But not this human. As his gaze lifted to the mansion, Lyra felt something stir deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. He was looking right at her. His eyes were calm, focused, and strangely compassionate, as if he saw past the wheelchair, past her paralyzed legs, straight into her soul. She was frozen, unsure of what to do. The human was still gazing up at her window. Was he aware she was watching him? Did he somehow know she was there, locked away, forgotten? No, it couldn't be. Humans couldn't sense things like that. And yet, she felt as though he could. For a moment, everything else faded. The mansion, the cold stone walls, the echo of her father's harsh commands. They all disappeared. There was only the human's steady gaze. It was as though time slowed, and Lyra felt like she was seen for the first time in her life. Seen for who she truly was. No pity, no judgment, just understanding. It was a strange feeling, one that felt like a lifeline, like a whisper in the darkness telling her she wasn't truly alone. But then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the human began to move. His gaze dropped, and with a purposeful step, he turned and began to walk away from the mansion's gate. Lyra blinked, her thoughts racing. Who was he? Why had he looked at her like that? Was it all just a fleeting moment, or was there something more? Something she couldn't yet understand. Her heart sank as she watched him walk out of view. The moment was gone, and she was left with the heavy silence of her room. But something had changed within her. There was a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that had been lit deep within her. Could it be possible that someone, even someone so different from her, could see her for more than just a disabled girl? Could there be someone who saw her as she truly was? That brief encounter, that moment of connection, would become the driving force behind Lyra's journey. It would spark a change she hadn't believed was possible, igniting a new purpose in her heart. The life she had accepted as her fate, a life of silence and isolation, was about to change. There was something waiting for her beyond the walls of her father's mansion. And maybe, just maybe, this human had unlocked the first step toward it. The human's secret mission. The next day, Lyra could barely contain the swirl of emotions that had taken root in her chest. The brief encounter with the human was still fresh in her mind, like a warm memory that refused to fade. She found herself wondering about him, who he was, why he had looked at her in that way, and what it all meant. But before she could ponder too long, something unexpected happened. She overheard voices, voices she hadn't expected to hear. The sound of her father's harsh tone came from the hallway outside her room. It was a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear, but as always, the servants had forgotten to lock her door. "Do not let him near her again," her father's voice echoed, cold and unyielding. "But my lord, the human," one of the servants hesitated. Lyra could hear the uncertainty in their voice. "He's requested access to the girl. He believes there is something more to her than what appears." Lyra's pulse quickened. The human. He had asked to see her. She had only caught a glimpse of him the day before, but now she knew he had been intentional in his gaze. She felt something stir inside her, a mix of curiosity and excitement. Who was this man who wanted to know her? "He is here on official business," her father's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Do not mistake his intentions. There is no place for a disabled child in my world, and no place for a human in this family's affairs. Keep him at a distance." There was a pause, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating. The conversation was over. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. Her father's words hit her like a cold wave, but the mention of the human intrigued her even more. She had heard the word business many times in her father's dealings, but this time it felt different. This human wasn't just passing through. He had a purpose. Lyra lay back in her bed, the events unfolding before her like a strange puzzle. What did the human want with her? And why was her father so determined to keep them apart? The answer came sooner than she expected. The following evening, Lyra heard the soft click of the door as it opened, and a familiar figure stepped into her room. It was him, the human. He looked around quickly, as if making sure no one followed him. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, everything else faded. He smiled at her, a kind smile, unlike any she had ever seen. There was no pity in his eyes, only warmth, curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite place. "My name is Jack," the human said softly, walking closer. His voice was calm, reassuring. "I'm here because I need your help." Lyra blinked, confusion clouding her thoughts. Her help. She was a cripple, a useless daughter in the eyes of her father. Why would anyone want her help? Jack seemed to sense her confusion. He paused, looking around the room, then lowered his voice even further. "I'm not here for your father, Lyra. I'm here because I've heard of your potential. I believe there's more to you than what meets the eye." Her heart skipped a beat. Did he know? Did he already know the truth? Lyra tried to push her doubts aside, but a part of her wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that someone, anyone, could see her differently. That someone could look at her, not as a burden, but as something greater. Jack continued, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "I'm not here by chance. I've been looking for you, for someone with the power to change the course of things on this planet. And I think you're the one who can do it." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Change the course of things. How could she, a paralyzed girl, possibly change anything? But the way Jack spoke made it seem as if she held the key to something important. "I can help you," Jack continued, "but only if you trust me. Trust that I can help you unlock your potential." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt something stir deep within her. Could it be possible? Could she really have some hidden power, something that could make a difference? She wasn't sure, but Jack's belief in her made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she had always thought. There was a new sense of determination in Jack's eyes. He had a plan. She could feel it. But Lyra also knew one thing for sure. Her life, as she knew it, was about to change forever. The father's wrath. The heavy doors to the grand hall slammed shut with a thunderous echo. Baron Tarek's cold stare burned into Jack as he stood at the center of the room. Lyra watched from the shadows of the balcony above, hidden behind the heavy curtains, her heart pounding. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she needed to know why her father was so afraid of Jack. Tarek's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. I don't know what lies you've whispered to her, human, but your time on Theron is over. You will not see her again. Jack stood his ground, calm and unwavering. I haven't lied to her, he said simply, his gaze meeting the Baron's with a quiet confidence. I only told her the truth, that she has potential you refuse to acknowledge. Lyra's breath caught. She leaned closer, straining to hear every word. Tarek's eyes narrowed, his fists clenched at his sides. She is nothing, he growled. Weak. Broken. She will never walk, and she will never lead. Jack took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. You see her as weak because you're afraid. A tense silence filled the room. Lyra felt the weight of Jack's words pierce the air like an arrow. Tarek's expression darkened. Afraid. He spat. I am afraid of nothing. Jack's gaze didn't waver. You're afraid of what she could become. You're afraid that despite everything, she will rise, and it will be without your help. You're afraid she'll prove you wrong. Lyra's hands tightened around the curtain. No one had ever dared to speak to her father like this. No one had ever defended her like this. Tarek's voice lowered, dangerous and cold. Leave this planet, Jack. If you step near her again, I will make sure you regret it. But Jack only smiled faintly, as if he had expected this. You can try to keep me away, Baron, he said. But you can't stop her from realizing her own strength. Whether you like it or not, she will see it for herself. And when she does, you won't be able to hold her back. Tarek's jaw tightened, but Jack had already turned and walked toward the exit. The heavy doors groaned open once more, and in an instant he was gone. Lyra stayed hidden as her father stood alone in the grand hall, his shoulders tense, his expression unreadable. But for the first time in her life, Lyra didn't feel small or powerless. Jack's words echoed in her mind. You can't stop her from realizing her own strength. A spark had been lit, and this time, Lyra wasn't going to let it fade. A moment of vulnerability. Night had fallen over the mansion, and silence wrapped around it like a heavy blanket. The grand halls, once filled with cold authority, now felt empty. Lyra sat by the window, the distant stars shimmering in the sky above. But her mind wasn't on the stars. It was on the human. She hadn't seen Jack since his confrontation with her father. Days had passed, and the mansion felt more suffocating than ever. The guards no longer let anyone near her room, and her father's presence was even colder, if that was possible. But that night, as the moonlight spilled across the floor, she heard it, a faint knock at her door. Lyra. Jack's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Her breath caught. She wheeled herself to the door, her hands trembling slightly as she unlatched it. Jack slipped inside, his eyes scanning the room briefly before meeting hers. You shouldn't be here, she said softly, though there was no anger in her voice. I know, Jack replied, sitting on the floor beside her chair. But I had to see you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra glanced at him, trying to read the expression on his face. He wasn't like the others who had pitied her. Jack looked at her as if she were whole, as if the wheels beneath her didn't define who she was. I heard what you said to my father, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. Jack looked away for a second, rubbing the back of his neck. I meant every word. Lyra's gaze dropped to her lap. You think I can change things, but you don't know me. You don't know what it's like to feel powerless. Jack leaned in, his voice softer now. I know more than you think. She glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. I wasn't born with strength, Jack admitted. I had to fight for it. People told me I wasn't enough, that I couldn't make a difference. I believed them for a long time. But then, I realized something. Lyra tilted her head slightly. What? Jack met her gaze, his eyes steady. I realized that strength isn't about what you can or can't do physically. It's about what you choose to do despite the odds. A heavy silence filled the room as Lyra processed his words. You've been surviving in a world that refuses to see you, Jack continued. And that takes more strength than you realize. Lyra felt her throat tighten. No one had ever said something like that to her. No one had acknowledged the weight she carried every day. For the first time, Lyra let her guard down. I used to dream of doing more, of being more, she admitted quietly. But my father, he's convinced I'll never be anything. Jack smiled faintly. Then prove him wrong. The words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. Lyra felt something shift inside her, something small, but undeniable. Jack wasn't offering her a cure or false hope. He was offering something much more valuable, a choice. I'm not asking you to be someone else, Jack said. I'm asking you to believe in the person you already are. Lyra looked out the window once more. The stars seemed a little brighter that night. Maybe, just maybe, Jack was right. The awakening. The storm rolled in without warning. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, casting shadows over the mansion as rain began to lash against the windows. Lyra sat quietly by the fire, staring at the flickering flames, her thoughts heavy. Jack's words had taken root in her mind, but doubt still clung to her heart. Prove him wrong. Her father had spent years proving her wrong, reminding her, time and time again, that she was broken, that she would never rise. A crack of thunder rattled the walls. Lyra barely flinched. But something else followed, faint footsteps echoing down the hall outside her room. She turned her head, listening closely. The steps didn't belong to the guards. They were lighter, faster. Jack. The door creaked open, and he slipped inside, soaked from the rain. His breath was heavy, and his eyes darted toward her urgently. Lyra, he whispered, closing the door behind him. We don't have much time. She furrowed her brow. What's happening? They know. Jack glanced toward the window, lightning illuminating the room. Your father's men. They found out I've been visiting you. They're coming for me. And for you. Lyra's heart raced. She wheeled back slightly, gripping the arms of her chair. What do they want from me? I haven't done anything. Jack stepped closer, kneeling beside her. That's the point, Lyra. You haven't done anything yet, but they know what you can become. His words hung in the air like the storm outside. Lyra shook her head. I don't understand. I'm just... No, Jack cut her off gently, his hand resting on hers. You've convinced yourself of that for too long, but deep down, you feel it, don't you? Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, the storm seemed to quiet. Feel what? She asked, though she already knew. Jack's gaze was unwavering. The power that's been locked away. The strength they don't want you to realize. A lump formed in Lyra's throat. She didn't want to believe it. And yet part of her had always known, like an itch just beneath the surface of her skin, one she had been too afraid to scratch. Suddenly, the door burst open. 2 guards stormed in, weapons drawn. Step away from the girl, one of them ordered. Jack stood, shielding Lyra. You don't have to do this. This is Baron Tarek's will, the guard said coldly. Lyra's hands trembled. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. But as the guards advanced, she felt the familiar weight pressing down, the same weight she had carried for years. But this time, it didn't crush her. It fueled her. Before the guards could take another step, Lyra's eyes glowed faintly. A strange pulse rippled through the room, causing the guards to stagger. The air grew heavier, as if responding to her presence. Jack turned to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Lyra. The guards froze. Confusion etched across their faces. The energy swirling around her was faint but undeniable, like the first breath of fire from a dormant volcano. Lyra exhaled slowly, her fingers curling around the armrests of her chair. She wasn't powerless. Not anymore. The final showdown. The great hall trembled beneath Lyra's fingertips. Baron Tarek stood at the far end, his cold gaze locked on her, but for the first time, there was something else in his eyes. Uncertainty. Jack stood to her right, his stance firm, though he stole a glance at Lyra, as if waiting to see if she would truly step into the role he believed she could fill. The guards hesitated, their weapons drawn but wavering. They had felt it too, the strange shift in the air, the pulse of energy that seemed to radiate from Lyra like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. But Lyra's heart wasn't sleeping anymore. Enough, Tarek's voice cut through the silence. I don't know what tricks you think you found, but you will not defy me, Lyra. You are nothing without me. You always have been. The words hit like stones. Once, they would have buried her beneath their weight. But tonight, they barely scratched the surface. I am not nothing, Lyra said, her voice calm but steady. Tarek's eyes narrowed. You can't even stand. I don't need to stand, she replied, gripping the arms of her chair. I only need to rise. As if responding to her words, the floor beneath her cracked slightly. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the stone, as if the mansion itself had been waiting for this moment. The guards stepped back, exchanging uncertain glances. Jack's voice was soft, almost in awe. You're doing it. Tarek's hand twitched at his side, his fingers itching toward the ceremonial blade he carried. You will obey me, Lyra. You are my daughter, and you. No. Lyra cut him off, her eyes locking onto his. For the first time, she met his stare without fear. I was never yours to control. A wave of invisible force swept through the hall. The chandeliers overhead swayed, and the guards stumbled backward. Tarek's blade slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor. Lyra's body remained still, yet the power around her was undeniable. Wild, raw, but hers to command. Jack smiled faintly, watching as Tarek's confidence cracked like glass. She's not afraid of you anymore, Jack said quietly, stepping beside Lyra. And that's what you feared all along. Tarek's mouth opened to argue, but no words came. The storm outside roared, lightning illuminating the hall in flashes, as if the sky itself bore witness to Lyra's rise. With every passing second, the weight of her father's shadow grew smaller, until it disappeared entirely. Lyra exhaled, feeling lighter than she ever had before. Tarek finally spoke, though his voice was quiet, defeated. What will you do now? Lyra's gaze softened. I'm going to live. The guards lowered their weapons, uncertain but unwilling to challenge what they didn't understand. Jack placed a hand on the back of Lyra's chair. Let's go. As they moved toward the great doors, Lyra didn't look back. The mansion that had once felt like a prison was no longer her cage. It was just a place she used to be. And out there, beyond the storm, her real story was just beginning. Beyond the storm. The rain had eased by the time Lyra and Jack left the mansion behind. The night air smelled fresh, cleansed by the storm, but the tension lingered like the faint echo of thunder in the distance. The path leading away from her father's estate felt longer than Lyra remembered, and each wheel turned carried more weight than the last. Jack walked beside her, quiet but present, his eyes occasionally drifting to the dark sky. Lyra could feel the unspoken question hanging between them. Where are we going? She finally asked, her voice breaking the stillness. Jack glanced down at her with a small smile. Away from the past. Lyra smirked faintly, though her heart still felt heavy. That's not exactly a destination. It's a start. Jack's pace slowed as he glanced back toward the distant silhouette of the mansion. Its tall spires barely pierced the horizon, like the fading memories of a place that once held her prisoner. And starting is the hardest part. Lyra's hands rested lightly on her chair's controls, her fingers twitching as if uncertain whether to press forward or turn back. I've spent years wondering what's beyond those walls, she admitted, her eyes locked on the road ahead. Now that I'm here, I don't know what to expect. Jack stopped walking. His silence was noticeable enough that Lyra halted, turning to face him. I didn't bring you out here without reason, Lyra, he said carefully. His gaze softened, but there was an unmistakable intensity in his voice. I believe in your potential, but I didn't come to Theron just to convince you to leave your father behind. Lyra narrowed her eyes slightly. Then why? Jack knelt in front of her, meeting her gaze at eye level. The storm clouds shifted above them, allowing the moon to break through, casting pale light over his face. "Because I know what you are," he said softly. Lyra blinked. "I'm a crippled alien girl who barely escaped her father's wrath." "No," Jack replied firmly. "You're something far more important." His words hung in the cool night air, heavy with meaning Lyra couldn't yet grasp. Jack straightened, motioning for her to follow. As they moved further from the mansion, the landscape around them shifted. Tall spires gave way to ancient ruins, broken stone structures that jutted out of the earth like forgotten relics. Lyra's eyes scanned the strange carvings along the walls as they passed. "These ruins," she began, running her fingers over the rough surface of one. "They've been here longer than my family's mansion." Jack nodded. "Longer than most of Theron's cities." Lyra's brow furrowed. "What does this have to do with me?" Jack paused beneath a crumbled archway, turning to face her. His expression grew serious. "These ruins belong to the first generation of your people, the originals who settled on this planet. They were gifted with abilities far beyond anything you've seen today." Lyra crossed her arms. "I thought those were just myths, old stories meant to entertain children." Jack smirked knowingly. "That's what they want you to think." She raised an eyebrow. "They?" "The elites," Jack answered, his gaze drifting toward the distant lights of the city below. "Your father included. They'd buried these stories because they feared what they couldn't control. The abilities your ancestors wielded, they weren't meant for rulers like your father. They were meant for those who could rise from nothing." Lyra's chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was excitement or dread. "I don't understand." Her voice was softer now. "What does this have to do with me?" Jack stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Because that power, the one the ancients wielded, it hasn't been lost. It's been waiting." He placed his hand lightly over her chest, just above her heart. "It's in you, Lyra." The words struck deeper than Lyra expected. She searched Jack's face for any sign of deception, but his confidence was unshakable. "Ever since the day you were born," he continued, "you've carried a spark of that ancient power. It's why your father feared you. It's why he kept you hidden, buried under the weight of his expectations and doubt." Lyra's hands tightened on the wheels of her chair. "He didn't fear me. He pitied me." Jack's eyes narrowed. "No, he saw your potential long before you ever did, and he knew that if you ever awakened it, there would be nothing he could do to stop you." The night air seemed colder as the realization washed over her. Memories she had buried, moments of strange, unexplainable sensations, flashed through her mind. Times when objects seemed lighter, or when the atmosphere around her would shift without reason. Jack crouched beside her once more, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "It's time to stop doubting yourself, Lyra. You have more power than you realize. But you need to let it rise." Lyra's breath trembled, her mind racing. "But how?" Jack smiled faintly. "That's the next part of our journey." Lyra looked out at the path ahead, stretching far beyond the ruins and into the wild unknown. The stars above seemed brighter now, like tiny beacons lighting the way. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what lay beyond the walls of her father's mansion. She was ready to find out who she truly was.